At nearly 13,000 feet below the surface, where sunlight has never dared to reach, and the crushing pressure of the ocean shapes the fate of everything resting in the abyss, the Titanic is still being devoured by silent bacteria that turn steel into dust. And yet, in the middle of this world of total destruction and twisted metal, researchers came across something that defies the logic of physics and time itself. Cabin C-55. While entire corridors collapse and the luxury of 1912 dissolves into rust, this small compartment remains like an almost intact time capsule, protecting secrets the deep sea could not erase. The problem is that what remains inside is not just wood and brass, but the echo of a promise that survived the end of the world. And today, we are finally going to uncover it in detail. If you want to understand how this archaeological miracle is possible and what it reveals about the final hours of the giant, subscribe now and prepare to enter a place where very few humans have ever dared to look. Going down into the inner remains of the Titanic is not a task for just anyone. It demands a precise and dangerous choreography between unpredictable underwater currents and the absolute darkness that rules the bottom of the North Atlantic. When remotely operated vehicles, our robotic eyes in this oppressive vastness, dive beyond the main wreckage and venture through the ship's dark corridors, every inch forward becomes a constant flirtation with disaster. Today, the ship's interior is a deadly maze of wreckage, where snapped cables and razor-sharp steel plates can trap the equipment at any moment. The natural expectation while navigating those old, corroded passageways is to find only the grim echo of the sinking, a cemetery of misshapen metal covered in thick layers of silt. But it was during one of these dangerous incursions into the depths of SeaDeck that the powerful lights cut through the darkness and revealed a scene that made researchers hold their breath in unison in front of the control monitors. There, surrounded by the crushing force of pressure, almost 400 times greater than at the surface, stood Cabin C-55, defying logic, time, and the marine biology that has spent more than a century relentlessly consuming the structures around it. While entire grand salons have simply vanished from existence, swept away by the brutal violence of the impact on the ocean floor, or slowly melted by colonies of iron-eating bacteria, the carved wooden walls and noble outlines of the furniture in this specific room tell an astonishing visual story of resistance. The physics behind this anomaly is fascinating on its own, involving complex dynamics of stagnant water pockets and the chemical treatment of the period's wood, factors that aligned to turn the room into a true bubble of protection against the ocean's obliterating force. And yet, what makes this submerged room one of the most revered places in the entire archaeological site is not only its stubborn architecture refusing to give way. Behind that remarkably preserved teak door lies a much deeper human echo, a silent memory that goes beyond naval engineering and reaches the most vulnerable point of our own mortality. The truth is, something was left behind in this room, an invisible mark of an unshakable life-or-death decision made during those final desperate hours, which still brings tears to historians' eyes when they revisit the footage. It is a very specific detail about the original occupants of this opulent room, the leader of a colossal retail empire and his wife, who made an almost unbelievable choice when panic took over the upper decks. And it is exactly this moving secret, this ultimate sacrifice that seems to have remained carved into the wood of this cabin, that we will reveal at the peak of our exploration. If uncovering the hidden secrets of history fascinates you, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and follow every step of this journey where science and human memory walk side by side. To understand the magnitude of what the robotic eyes found inside that cabin, we first need to face the brutal reality of the environment surrounding it, a place where nature itself seems to have declared war on every trace of human civilization. Nearly 13,000 feet below the surface, we are not merely in deep water. We are in a territory of extreme physics, where hydrostatic pressure reaches levels that challenge our ordinary understanding of reality. Imagine the force of almost 400 atmospheres pressing down on every square inch of a structure. It is like placing the weight of an elephant on the tip of a thumb, an invisible and constant force searching for any weakness, any crack, in order to implode and crush whatever it finds in its path. And it was under this titanic weight that the ship's carcass came to rest after a violent descent that lasted only a few minutes, but changed the steel structure forever at the moment it struck the ocean floor. Beyond the pressure, the cold is a silent enemy that keeps everything in a kind of suspended animation, with temperatures hovering near freezing. Yet, paradoxically, it does not stop the action of invisible and hungry biological life. The greatest predator of this giant is not abyssal fish or powerful currents, but a microscopic life form identified only recently, a bacterium named after the ship itself, which feeds exclusively on iron. These microorganisms are in no hurry. They have centuries on their side, and they work through a kind of collective chemical digestion, transforming solid steel plates into fragile, porous structures that resemble hanging rust formations. Have you ever stopped to think that what we see in the images today is no longer the original metal, but an exhalation of minerals dripping like blood-red tears down the ship's sides? These rusticles, as they are technically known, are a clear sign that the ocean is reclaiming what was taken from the Earth, turning the pride of Edwardian engineering into a pile of red dust that dissolves at the slightest touch of the currents. This biological and chemical destruction is accompanied by structural collapse, turning the ship's interior into a deadly and chaotic trap, where what were once lavish dining rooms and elegant promenade areas are now compressed layers of debris. As bacteria consume the rivets and support beams, the ceiling of one deck becomes the floor of another in a cascading process of slow destruction, one that has already caused the roof of the gymnasium and parts of the famous grand staircase to disappear completely. Where there was once the shine of polished oak and the sound of orchestras, there is now only marine snow, organic debris that constantly falls from the surface, covering the mud and wreckage with a ghostly blanket of forgetfulness. The problem is that this process of degradation is not uniform. It chooses its victims with random cruelty, making entire sections of the stern look as if they passed through a giant meat grinder, while other parts of the bow still preserve a melancholic dignity. It is within this landscape of molecular chaos and constant collapse that the preservation of internal spaces becomes a mystery that confuses even the most experienced naval engineers, because logic says the interior should have been the first to give way. When the outer steel walls fail, water rushes in with a force that should tear away furniture, paneling, and decoration, turning everything into a soup of wooden splinters and rotten fabric. And yet, when we observe the ruins around the section where C deck is located, we realize that the giant did not simply sink. It became a hostile ecosystem where the chemistry of salt water and the lack of oxygen in certain areas created very specific conditions for the survival of a few secrets. The question hanging in the air, among the rust particles drifting through the darkness, is how a simple wooden door and a set of decorated walls managed to survive where high-strength steel beams failed miserably. And that completely changes what we know about the resistance of materials under extreme conditions, suggesting a combination of structural luck within the ship and a kind of material engineering that, perhaps unknowingly, created an almost impenetrable barrier against the erosion of time. The survival of cabin C-55 is not the result of some mystical coincidence. It is the outcome of an unlikely mathematical combination between the room's structural location and the chemistry of the materials used in 1912. To understand why this room endured while entire salons were crushed, We need to return to that moonless night, to the exact moment when the steel giant met its fate in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Contrary to what common sense might suggest, the impact with the iceberg was not a head-on collision that would have instantly destroyed the bow, but a submerged side scrape, an almost subtle touch that sliced the hull below the waterline across several compartments. This type of damage meant the ship did not stop abruptly, but continued on its course as water silently and fatally invaded its inner structure. The problem is that, unlike the lookouts trying to spot danger without binoculars in total darkness, the ocean knew exactly where to enter, beginning a flooding process that would determine the selective preservation of certain spaces. As the ship, proud beneath its 4 towering funnels, began to tilt heavily by the bow, the physics of the sinking started creating pockets of protection in very specific areas near the middle of the vessel. Cabin C-55 was strategically positioned in a section of sea deck that, during most of the final plunge, remained in a zone of relative hydraulic balance. When Titanic finally broke in two, with the front section diving first and the stern rising before also being claimed by the abyss, this central section suffered less from the violent suction and compressed air currents that imploded other compartments. Have you ever stopped to think that, in the middle of such absolute chaos, the closing of a simple teak door may have been the difference between eternal preservation and total destruction? Because the doors of this cabin were closed and well sealed, water did not enter like a destructive flood tearing furniture from the walls. Instead, it seeped in slowly, allowing the internal and external pressure to equalize gradually, without causing the mechanical collapse of the partitions. But the physics of pressure is only half the explanation, because the true secret behind the immortality of C-55 lies in the choice of materials and the chemical treatments applied by the craftsmen of the time. The furniture and wall panels were made from fine woods such as oak, mahogany, and teak, materials known for their exceptional density and natural resistance to decay. At the time, wood intended for the highest levels of maritime luxury received intense treatments with oils and heavy varnishes, substances that, ironically, acted as natural biocides over more than a century underwater. When the cabin reached the ocean floor, nearly 13,000 feet down, it entered an anoxic environment, meaning an area with extremely low oxygen levels, which drastically slowed the action of bacteria that normally consume cellulose. It is as if the chemists and artisans of 1912 had unknowingly prepared that room to be displayed in an eternal museum, where the lack of light and the extreme cold froze time within those 4 walls. And in that moment, science and art merged to protect what remained. While the rest of the ship was being chewed away by abyssal currents, the central location of C-55 kept it shielded from the strongest external currents that scour the outside of the hull. Picture the scene on the bridge minutes before the collision. Beyond the windows was absolute darkness, a star-filled night over a sea that was far too calm, where the absence of binoculars kept disaster from being avoided in time. That same darkness that sealed the fate of more than 1,500 souls now serves as the cloak, protecting the integrity of the polished wood and brass details that still shine beneath the lights of modern robots. The truth is that cabin C-55 became a thermal and biological anomaly, where the absence of oxygen and the physical protection of the outer steel walls created a sanctuary untouched by the appetite of iron-eating bacteria. This completely changes what we know about the longevity of human wreckage in the deep sea, because it shows us that, under ideal conditions, the material memory of a civilization can persist far longer than expected. To truly understand what the mechanical eyes are seeing today among the shadows of rust and accumulated silt, we need to remove, layer by layer, a century of forgetting and mentally reconstruct the splendor that once defined cabin C-55. We are not talking about a simple passenger room, but about one of the highest expressions of early 20th century social and aesthetic engineering. A floating palatial apartment designed to house the most powerful and influential elite the world had ever known. If we crossed through the polished oak doorway in April 1912, the smell of new wood, the scent of expensive tobacco, and the soft touch of silk fabrics would carry us into an environment of opulence that seemed to ignore the fact that we were crossing the Atlantic at more than 20 knots. The style chosen for this sanctuary was imperial, specifically Louis XVI, evoking the grandeur of Versailles with its straight lines, finely carved white panels, and a sense of proportion that radiated aristocratic calm, far removed from the predictable movement of the waves outside. The layout of the suite was a masterpiece of privacy and functionality, made up of 2 spacious bedrooms, a private sitting room, and, an almost unimaginable luxury for the period, a private bathroom with finishes that would make any hotel on land feel inferior. Visualize walls covered with pastel damask silk panels, reflecting the warm glow of crystal electric lamps, and creating a welcoming atmosphere that violently contrasted with the absolute darkness that now dominates the site. In the center of the main bedroom, there were no narrow bunks like those common in the lower classes, but a monumental polished brass bed with ornamental details glowing under soft lighting, suggesting a level of comfort that challenged the idea that Titanic was merely a means of transportation. Every detail, from the white marble washstand with silver-plated taps to the built-in dark mahogany wardrobes, was installed to reinforce the status of its occupants. This was a setting where wealth was not merely possessed. It was lived in its purest and most detailed form. One of the most extraordinary and rare items in C-55, and one that still fascinates explorers who visit the wreck today, was the decorative electric fireplace, a feature found in very few cabins on the entire ship, usually reserved for the most prestigious suites. At the time, having a fireplace aboard a steel ocean liner was the ultimate symbol of sophistication, allowing occupants to enjoy moments of reading and private conversation beside an artificial warmth that imitated the fireplace of their own mansion back on solid ground. Under the gaze of today's underwater robots, that same fireplace now serves as a ghostly pedestal for objects that time could not carry away, such as small porcelain containers and bronze details that still remain in their original places, defying the current. It is fascinating to notice how the marble of the washstand, even covered by a thin layer of marine sediment, still maintains its structural integrity, reminding us that the choice of these materials was not based only on beauty, but on a durability that, by a twist of fate, proved capable of withstanding even the weight of the ocean. As we cross the threshold between physical reconstruction and human memory, we begin to understand that cabin C-55 was not only a monument to opulence, but the final setting of one of the deepest demonstrations of loyalty ever recorded in modern history. The occupants of this imperial apartment were not ordinary first-class passengers. They represented the embodiment of success and ethics in an era that was about to vanish beneath the icy waves. The man who occupied this space was the owner of one of the largest and most famous department stores in the world, a respected business leader whose decisions shaped the consumer culture of New York, while his wife was his inseparable companion of decades, a woman whose dignity rivaled that of European nobility. But the problem is that, on that April night, all the influence and wealth accumulated by this elderly couple would become meaningless before the cold reality of a miscalculation that began long before the water touched the hull. While they rested in the security of this lavish suite, high above them on the bridge, the crew faced a night of deceptive visibility, where the sea was too calm to create the white foam needed to reveal the base of the icebergs, and the lack of binoculars for the lookouts sealed everyone's fate with terrifying speed. And then the silence of the night was cut by a dry, metallic sound. A side scrape that did not feel like a violent head-on collision, but like a submerged touch slicing through steel plates as if they were parchment. Inside C-55, the impact may have felt only like a distant tremor, a vibration that might barely have made the crystal pitchers on the marble surface shake, but it started the clock of mortality. Have you ever felt that instinct that something has changed forever, even before you see the danger with your own eyes? As the ship, with its 4 majestic funnels silhouetted against the stars, began to tilt slightly by the bow, the elderly couple prepared themselves with the same calm they had shown in their social gatherings. The officer in charge of the lifeboat evacuation, recognizing the importance and advanced age of the businessman, offered him an exception to the strict rule of women and children first, inviting him to accompany his wife and secure his survival amid the growing chaos taking over the upper decks. The man's answer, however, remains one of the pillars of human integrity. He firmly refused to enter a lifeboat while other men, younger men with families, were still waiting for their chance. He chose honor over survival, a decision that placed his wife before a devastating dilemma no wealth in the world could solve. What happened next is what gives soul to the preserved walls of C-55 that we see today on the monitors of underwater robots. Faced with the officer's insistence that she save herself, the woman stepped out of lifeboat number 8, looked into the eyes of the man with whom she had shared an entire life, and spoke the words that would echo through the centuries. "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." And that completely changes what we know about human desperation, because in that instant, the fear of death was overcome by absolute devotion, turning the sinking into an act of final unity. They chose to return into the ship, possibly passing once more through the door of cabin C-55 to seek one last private moment, or heading up to the promenade deck to wait for the end together, seated side by side in wicker chairs as the steel giant began its final plunge. The truth is that the physical preservation of that cabin feels like nature's own tribute to that sacrifice. It is as if the ocean decided to spare the place where that love was lived for the last time. As we leave behind the echo of that human sacrifice and turn our lenses again toward the physical reality resting on sea deck, we are struck by an almost mystical impression that time, for cabin C-55, chose to operate under different laws from the rest of the world. When the powerful LED lights of underwater robots sweep across the darkness, what appears before us is not merely the skeleton of a ship, but a ghostly vision that challenges our understanding of impermanence. Where the outer steel has been transformed into cascades of rust that seem to melt like candle wax, the interior of this specific suite remains in a state of order so unsettling that it feels as though the ocean took care not to disturb the setting of such a noble farewell. Have you ever felt that chill while looking at a place where life seems to have just stepped out, leaving only silence behind as a witness? That is exactly the feeling that overtakes ROV operators when the camera stabilizes and reveals, on what remains of the marble fireplace, the iconic bronze clock that still seems to mark the hours of a century refusing to die. That clock, even covered by a thin film of sediment and surrounded by the marine snow that falls endlessly, remains like a metallic sentinel, an object that survived the violent descent, the crushing pressure, and the acidic corrosion of deep water. Observing details like this makes us realize that Titanic is not simply a pile of twisted metal, but a submerged museum where architecture and human history have fused into something inseparable. The problem is that, as the robots move inch by inch through the interior of the cabin, we notice that the imperial luxury described earlier is now an ethereal shadow. The silk panels that once decorated the walls disappeared long ago, leaving exposed the grooves of treated wood that, through some miracle of physics, still supports the weight of the ceiling. It is fascinating to see how porcelain containers and a few personal hygiene items still rest on the washstand, exactly where they were left on that fateful night. As if gravity and pressure had made a pact not to move anything that belonged to the couple who lived there. The atmosphere inside C-55 today is one of absolute stillness, interrupted only by the faint hum of the robot's thrusters and the movement of rust particles floating like dust in an abandoned attic. Through the cameras, we can see the details of the carved wood on the door and the mahogany cabinets, which still preserve their original shapes thanks to the chemical protection and thermal isolation we mentioned earlier. What makes this site so powerful is not only the preservation itself, but the contrast between the fragility of what remains and the raw force of nature surrounding the room on every side. If we look out through the cabin window, the darkness is total, and the pressure is nearly 400 atmospheres, a force that should have reduced everything to dust. But inside, calm reigns as if we were in a submerged art gallery. In the end, Edwardian engineering proved to have a strength even its own creators could not have predicted in their most optimistic calculations. At the end of this journey, when the lights of the submersibles finally go out and we leave cabin C-55 once again immersed in its eternal darkness, we are left with the clear feeling that Titanic is far more than a mass of twisted steel or a cold statistic in a maritime history book. Over more than a century, it has become a true submerged museum of human stories, a sacred place where architecture, through some inexplicable miracle of nature and physics, has stubbornly refused to erase the memory of those who passed through it. The preservation of that luxurious room, with its bronze clock still in place and its wooden panels defying biological decay, serves as a powerful reminder that dignity and legacy have a resistance stronger than even the crushing force of 400 atmospheres. Have you ever stopped to reflect on how the essence of a life can be preserved in small details? In a door that remained closed? Or in an object that refused to be carried away by the currents of forgetting? Cabin C-55 teaches us that while the ocean works tirelessly to devour the metal of the giant that once displayed 4 towering funnels, the soul of the ship lives precisely where the technology of 1912 failed, but humanity prevailed. To contemplate the remains of this room is, ultimately, to look at an altar untouched by time, one that protects the echo of the sacrifice made by an elderly couple who chose to face the abyss hand in hand rather than accept a lonely salvation. The truth is that the imperial luxury of silks and marble has lost its color, but the story of loyalty written between those teak walls has become immortal, turning a catastrophic shipwreck into an example of spiritual resilience that still touches us deeply. This technical and human investigation into C-55 completely changes what we know about the preservation of memory at the bottom of the sea, suggesting that the ocean, in its ruthless immensity, sometimes chooses what must be spared, so future generations do not forget who we were. The silence that now reigns nearly 13,000 feet below the surface is not a silence of absence, but one of respect for a past that refuses to be erased by iron-eating bacteria or by the weight of the centuries that have gathered since that night, when the lack of binoculars sealed the ship's fate. As we watch the ghostly silhouette of the vessel disappear into the shadows, while the submersible begins its ascent toward the surface, we carry with us the lesson that the true value of an existence is not found in what we build with steel and brass, but in the marks of character we leave behind when all the lights go out. Titanic will continue its slow descent into physical oblivion, melting into red dust as the bow sinks ever deeper into the mud. But sanctuaries like cabin C-55 ensure that the human soul remains alive, protected inside a capsule of wood and dignity that the Atlantic will never fully crush. It is fascinating to think that the same physics that allowed the bow to sink first, causing the ship to break in two and the stern to follow its final fate, also allowed this specific cabin to remain isolated, transforming a tragedy of errors into a miracle of preservation. Cabin C-55 reminds us, with its melancholic and unsettling beauty, that Titanic is much more than twisted steel. It is a testament to the idea that memory, when anchored in acts of bravery and love, is the only thing that truly survives the shipwreck of time. If exploring these hidden mysteries at the bottom of the ocean and diving into the depths of human history fascinates you, I leave you with my sincerest invitation to subscribe to the channel and join our community of explorers of the past. There are many more secrets hidden in the shadows of history, waiting only for the right light to reveal them in full. And it will be an honor to have you with us on each of these journeys. Thank you for following us to the bottom of the abyss on this journey through the preservation of the unforgettable. And until our next cinematic expedition, where we will continue giving a voice to what the silence of time tried to bury.